Oh, okay.
Can I help you?
No, it's okay.
That'll stay with you all.
The committee will come to order. Good morning. Over the past 6 months, this committee has investigated the Internal Revenue Service's targeting of conservative groups. Though our investigation is not complete and the IRS still has many more documents to provide to the committee, we've discovered a concerted effort by the IRS to limit the ability of those targeted conservative groups to operate and engage in constitutionally protected public debate. Some in Washington have tried to sweep this under the rug, calling the IRS targeting an attempt to streamline determinations that was based in confusion about the rules. That rhetoric does not match the reality of what this investigation has uncovered so far. Before February 2010, the IRS was processing and approving Tea Party cases within 3 months without Washington, D.C. intervention. Conservative and Tea Party cases were flagged due to media attention in February 2010, not as a result of any confusion as to how to interpret 501c4 law. Additionally, we now know that the IRS targeted not only right-leaning applicants, but also right-leaning groups that were already operating as 501c4s. At Washington, D.C.'s direction, dozens of groups operating as 501c4s were flagged for IRS surveillance, including monitoring of the group's activities, websites, and any other publicly available information. Of these groups, 83% were right-leaning, and of the groups the IRS selected for audit, 100% were right-leaning. All of this provides context for today's markup, which is legislation we're considering that would stop the ability of the IRS and Treasury to legalize the targeting of conservative groups. On Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, Treasury released proposed rules regarding 501c4s that would essentially remove conservative groups from the public square. The rationale of the IRS and Treasury was that the rules, which have been in place for more than 50 years, created confusion. However, we learned that Treasury and the IRS had been working on these guidelines behind closed doors for years. According to interviews with IRS employees as early as 2011, work started on new 501c4 regulations. A June 2012 email between Treasury officials and then IRS Director of Tax-Exempt Organizations, Lois Lerner, revealed that these potential regulations were being discussed, quote, off-plan, meaning that the plans for the regulations were not to be published on the public schedule. Treasury's fabricated rationale for changing a 50-year-old rule raises serious questions about the integrity of the rulemaking process and counsels for putting a hold on the draft rules. It's important to note that the committee has made these discoveries without even having the full universe of documents requested from the IRS, including thousands of documents from Lois Lerner that have not yet been provided. Simply put, our investigation is not yet over. The document collection is not yet complete, and I don't believe the IRS or the FBI has interviewed a single victim. The notion that the administration would rush forward with rules intended to remove these groups from the public forum is simply unacceptable. Under these proposed rules, activities such as candidate forums, get-out-the-vote efforts, and voter registration would now be considered political activity for 501c4 groups. It's notable to mention that these activities would not be considered political for 501c3s, who cannot engage in any political activity, or for unions. I've long made clear that this committee will fight any and all efforts to restrict the rights of groups to organize, speak out, and educate the public. The legislation before us today would prevent these rules from being implemented by this administration for 1 year. This time frame would allow Congress to finish our investigation and ensure that the agency processes what is already a record number of public comments, more than 23,000 so far, so that the IRS and Treasury can really get to the merits of why these rules were formed. Groups should be treated fairly regardless of their political beliefs. The Stop Targeting of Political Beliefs by the IRS Act ensures that this administration will not be allowed to discriminate against groups based on their politics. Before I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement, I ask that all member opening statements be included in the record, and without objection, so ordered. Mr. Levin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It has been nearly 9 months since the Inspector General's IRS audit report was published. And yet Republicans are no closer today to finding any evidence to back up their baseless allegations of White House corruption than when they began making those claims immediately after the report came out, including during this committee's first hearing on the matter, May 17. Instead of this prestigious committee using its broad jurisdiction to address critical issues that confront us, it has been consumed by a tireless effort by Republicans to find political scandal, regardless of what the truth holds, as they look forward toward the November election. That focus does not live up to the long, honorable tradition of this vital committee. And I want to add, I think this hearing represents a sad day for this committee. More than 500,000 pages of IRS documents have been turned over to congressional committees. 6 interviews of current and former IRS employees have taken place. Lawmakers at 15 congressional hearings have questioned IRS officials. In all, more than 150 IRS employees have worked 70,000 hours, time taken away from taxpayer services, to accommodate the ongoing request for information from congressional investigators. And yet, there's been absolutely no evidence of any corruption unearthed. Not a single piece of evidence showing any political motivation. Nothing showing any involvement outside the IRS. Had the Treasury Inspector General not left out vital information, producing a fundamentally flawed audit report, it may have dissuaded Republicans from immediately accusing, as they did, the White House of keeping a so-called enemies list and trying to turn the audit into a scandal that they are intent on keeping alive no matter the facts. For one, the IG failed to disclose that progressive and other liberal groups were singled out alongside Tea Party organizations and were among the 298 organizations that he reviewed in his audit. What's more, not until 2 months after the audit report was published did we learn that the IG had instructed his chief investigator to look into the possibility of political motivation by the IRS, and that the investigator had concluded that it was confusion, not political motivation, that led IRS employees to single out organizations for further scrutiny. On May 3, 11 days before the audit report was published, the IG's chief investigator summed up his findings in an email to the senior staff at TIGTA. He wrote, and I quote, "There was no indication that pulling these selected applications was politically motivated. The email traffic indicated there were unclear processing directions, and the group wanted to make sure they had guidance on processing the applications, so they pulled them. This is a very important nuance," he concluded. Indeed it is, and it is precisely the lack of clarity that the IRS was responding to in proposing new regulations for 501c4 organizations new regulations that are designed to bring certainty in determining whether an organization's primary activities are political. The regulations are among several steps that the IG himself recommended in his audit report that the IRS undertake, each of which the IRS has acted upon, I should note. They are anything but final, and I and many of my colleagues on this committee have our own questions about aspects of them. But the proposed regulations are an important start to bringing both clarity to what now are wholly confusing rules governing 501c4 and much-needed disclosure by organizations spending heavily to influence elections. Applications for 501c4 status nearly doubled between 2010 and 2012, nearly doubled to 3,357. The designation allows organizations to keep their donors secret. Spending, and I emphasize this, during the 2012 election by 501c4s soared to more than $250 million, from $92 million in 2010 and just $1 million in 2006, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. Unfortunately, the proposed regulations are being used by Republicans in Congress to renew a tireless campaign to turn the issue into a scandal that would pay political dividends. Last week, they pointed to a 2012 email as evidence that the IRS was considering making changes to regulations 2 years ago, claiming that the employee's use of the term, in quotes, off-plan suggested the IRS was hoping to hide its work from the public. The irony is that in seeking to delay these regulations for a year under the guise of a scandal, what really remains hidden are donors to groups pouring millions of dollars into campaign advertising, remaining hidden. The truth is that the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration has recommended consideration of guidance on how to measure the primary activities of 501c4 social welfare organizations, and the Treasury included that in its priority guidance plan in August 2013. Without a shred of evidence to keep alive their allegation that the White House was targeting its political enemies, Republicans have now turned to the proposed regulations to renew their attack. This committee has started the new year where it left off, showing painfully little interest in legislation, and instead of keeping its politically based dual focus squarely on seeking to unearth scandal in the IRS where none exists and undermining the ACA.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 3865, the Stop Targeting of Political Beliefs by the IRS Act of 2014. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Mr. Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Levin, members of the committee. You have before you Joint Committee documents JCX 6, which describes the underlying bill, H.R. 3865, and JCX 7, which describes the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Very briefly, under present law and the regulations, a 501c4 organization is an organization that's engaged primarily in promoting in some way the common good and general welfare of the people of the community. Not included in activities that promote the common good and general welfare are certain political campaign intervention activities. The Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute would provide that neither the Secretary of the Treasury nor any delegate of the Secretary of the Treasury could modify the rules used to determine whether an organization is so operated as those rules existed from January 1st, 2010 on. That concludes my description of the Chairman's amendment, the nature of substitute. Happy to answer any details of present law or of the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. This legislation basically just delays the rulemaking process for 1 year. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And isn't it true that under current law, 501c3, a charitable organization, can hold a public candidate forum for the purpose of informing and educating voters in a fair and impartial way within 60 days of an election?
Yes, sir. Fair and impartial candidate forums are permitted under the regulations.
So the IRS does not view nonpartisan candidate forums as political activity?
Under present law and regulations, that's correct, sir.
And under current law, if a 501c4 conducts the same nonpartisan candidate forum, does it count as exempt social welfare activity?
It's considered exempt social welfare activity. It's not campaign-related activity.
And therefore permissible.
It is permissible.
And under current law, if a 501c5, typically unions, conducts the same nonpartisan candidate forum, does it count as exempt union activity?
Yes, sir, it does. The same standard applies.
So under current law, if a 501c6, trade associations, chambers of commerce, conduct the same nonpartisan candidate forum, does that count as exempt chamber of commerce activity?
Yes, sir, it does. The same standard applies.
So under the proposed regulation, can a 501c3 charitable organization conduct a nonpartisan candidate forum within 60 days of an election?
Yes, sir.
And under the proposed regulation, can a 501c5 union conduct a nonpartisan candidate forum within 60 days of an election?
Yes, sir.
So that counts as exempt union activity. And under the proposed regulations, can a 501c6 Chamber of Commerce organization conduct a nonpartisan candidate forum within 60 days of an election?
Yes, sir.
So that again would count as exempt Chamber of Commerce activity. So under the proposed regulations, can a 501c4 conduct a nonpartisan candidate forum within 60 days of an election? Does that?
Under the proposed regulation, that would be prohibited it would be considered candidate-related political activity, and it would then subject the organization to the general test of are they primarily operated for social welfare.
So for a C4 only, a 501c4 only, it would not count as exempt social welfare.
The proposed regulations would draw that distinction between those organizations, Mr. Chairman.
Do these proposed regulations respond to some kind of revenue loss or some tax avoidance scheme?
Not that I'm aware of, sir. These organizations are generally exempt, and revenue loss has not been identified as the basis for the proposed regulations.
All right, and again, this proposed legislation does not prohibit for all time Treasury from pursuing this regulation, but just delays for 1 year the proposal.
Yes, sir. Your legislation would delay modification of the existing regulations for 1 year from the date of enactment of the legislation.
All right, thank you. Mr. Levin's recognized.
It's interesting that the chairman's picked out one aspect, and we have questions about that one aspect. These regulations are not final, are they not, Mr. Bartow?
No, they are proposed regulations, as the chairman noted, and that Treasury and Service have requested comment.
Right, and how many comments have there been?
I believe the commissioner noted that there are over 23,000, and I believe the chairman cited the same facts in his opening statement.
Are the names of contributors to 501c4s, are they disclosed?
As part of its application, a 501c4 organization provides the names of certain major contributors to the IRS. These names are not made public, though, sir.
So all the contributions to these organizations are not disclosed, is that not correct?
Not disclosed to the public.
Exactly.
Major contributors
But
are disclosed to the
they're
IRS.
not disclosed to the public.
That's correct.
Do you, I cited the fact that spending during the 2012 election by 501c4s soared to more than $250 million, while in 2006 it was $1 million. Do you have any question about that fact?
I'd have to check with my colleagues who track the data on a more careful basis, so I have no reason to question your facts, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important markup. Any American, including the members of the Allen area Patriots back in Allen, Texas, are seeking to express their support for our hard-fought freedoms and liberties, for a limited government, for a better America. They should never be subjected to intimidation because of their political beliefs. Never. The bottom line is the IRS was simply used as a political weapon. In spite of President Obama's expressing his anger and calling the IRS acts inexcusable, he and his administration want to continue this practice with new rules that would once again target and stifle these very same groups. These new rules would effectively deny these groups fundamental freedom to participate and engage in the democratic process. That's wrong. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. I've got several questions for Mr. Barthold. Mr. Barthold, thank you. The law on tax-exempt organizations can be complex, so I'd like some simple yes or no answers, please. Is it correct to say that, under current law, a 501c4 organization is allowed to engage in some political campaign intervention as long as it primarily engaged in the promotion of social welfare?
That's the current law standard under the regulations, sir. That's correct.
Thank you. Okay. Under current law, the promotion of social welfare includes activities like bipartisan voter registration drives, bipartisan voter guides, and bipartisan candidate forums. Is that correct? Yes or no?
Neutral voter guides and forums are all permitted under the...
Okay, under the new proposed regulation, are those activities considered social welfare? Yes or no?
Under the proposed regulations, they would be considered candidate-related political activity, and you would then have the organization subject to the primarily engaged.
So they're not considered welfare then?
They're not considered good social
Thank you.
welfare.
Under the proposed regulations, these very same activities are considered political campaign intervention. Is that correct?
The proposed
Yes
regulation,
or no?
Yes, with a little bit of a gloss that they changed the definition.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, it's clear the IRS is once again overstepping its authority, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Rangel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a painful discussion, especially in bringing in Mr. Barthold, who has gone out of his way over the years to avoid any political controversy. But the truth of the matter is, it's pretty clear to the American people, and certainly by the small size of this audience, that the Republicans have exhausted finding any substantive questions to raise as it relates to the coming midterm election. I really think that the Affordable Care Act has been damaged enough as it incorporates so many people that never had the opportunity to have access to health care. Nevertheless, what we're doing right now is damaging the integrity of the Internal Revenue Service, and that is a very sensitive issue inasmuch as we have a volunteer system, and the more people that lose confidence in it, the more people probably would be avoiding paying their legitimate taxes. Having said that, Mr. Barthold, is there any way to determine whether people made application for 501c4s were more liberal or more conservative as to who made the application based on the information that Congressman Levin has said in newspaper reports on the ability to have donors that were not, their names were not disclosed. Would you know whether the liberal side or the conservative side, who took more advantage of the provisions that allowed undisclosed donors?
Mr. Engel, my colleagues and I have not been part of the investigation that the various congressional committees have engaged in, so I have no special knowledge of the total number.
Well, suppose since you have no knowledge of this national scandal that the Republicans are portraying, do you have, in a hypothetical, if the applications were like jelly beans and you had blue jelly beans applying and you put them in a jar, and then you had an overwhelming amount of red jelly beans applying, and you had to test the integrity of the jelly beans, and you reached in and pull out a handful, would not just common sense dictate that you'd have more red jelly beans in your hands to look at than blue ones?
Mr. Engel, I think you're suggesting that if you just took a random statistical sample and there were more red jelly beans in an unmarked jar than there were blue jelly beans, that your random statistical sample would reveal more red jelly beans than blue jelly beans.
And if you were the producer of these jelly beans that did not reach a decent standard, and you were the manufacturer of them, you would say that you were picking on the red jelly bean manufacturers when basically they were not meeting a standard that was acceptable by consumers.
In my statistical sample, I wouldn't make comments about the jelly beans.
Well, if the Tea Party were jelly beans, well, can you say whether or not, as a professional, as a citizen, that this administration has evidence of corruption, political corruption as it relates to the Internal Revenue Service? Do you have, is there any one scintilla of evidence that your professional staff came across in the course of your limited understanding of this subject?
Well, again, Mr. Engel, I think you're asking a question about the various inquiries, including the inquiry of the Inspector General as well as the congressional inquiries. My colleagues and I have not been part of those inquiries, so I really can't comment on your question. I'm sorry, sir.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Teaberry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit for the record a letter from Penny Nance, CEO and President of Concerned Women for America Legislative Action Committee, in support of this legislation.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I think some of the committee members might have forgotten some of the testimony that has been right before this committee that is no laughing matter. A grandmother from northwestern Ohio ran an organization that never supported any candidates, harassed by the IRS. A gentleman from suburban Cincinnati, a small businessman, who was on a questionnaire from the IRS. IRS put his name on a questionnaire and sent it to another organization and asked if they knew this man and what their affiliation was with this man on an IRS questionnaire. This isn't some made-up, make-believe, no, nothing happened. This is something that happened, that continued to happen, not just in my state, but all over America. And we heard testimony. And at the same time, the IRS wants to codify the targeting that this committee heard about last year. And by the way, Mr. Thomas still doesn't know why his name appeared on a questionnaire from the IRS. Now, whether you're a Republican, a socialist, a Democrat, a Libertarian, a Green Party person, that should be offensive. That should be offensive to every one of the members of this committee. And I have friends on the other side of the aisle. I don't know why you don't think that's offensive. I don't know why you don't think that's a concern that we should have. That's not a mistake. You don't put a guy's name on a questionnaire because there was confusion. That was targeting. Now, we can gloss over that, ladies and gentlemen of this committee. We can do that. We can pretend this is all just make-believe and not very important and somebody was just asleep at the switch. Shame on us if we do that. This shouldn't matter who the President of the United States is. This should matter about individuals in our country who have no confidence in an agency that historically has been nonpartisan. And clearly, they were partisan. And Mr. Bartold, please correct me if I'm wrong, but in reading this two-page bill, it appears as though this just delays this for 1 year. Am I correct?
That's correct. It delays any rulemaking for 1 year from the date of enactment, sir.
I almost would like to amend the bill, Mr. Chairman, to say it'd be nice to find out why an individual's name was on a questionnaire for an organization submitting for this status, and delay it until the IRS tells us why his name was on this questionnaire. This is serious. If any one of us had our name on a questionnaire sent to some organization, whether liberal, conservative, nonpartisan, we would all be concerned about that, wouldn't we? So, Mr. Chairman, I applaud you for taking this up today. This shouldn't be looked at partisanship at all. This should be looked at getting to the bottom of something that should be troubling to each and every one of us as we are here today with answers to questions that yet have gone unanswered. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On February 5th, that's 6 days ago, the Republican leadership of the House and Senate wrote a letter to the IRS commissioner in which they said, quote, "The timing of this rule appears calculated to take effect just in time for the midterm elections, giving the strong appearance of strong motivation." Now, this is political theater. This is all this is theater. If you're just tuning in, the Republicans would like people to think that the Treasury just spontaneously decided to have proposed regulations on 501c4 organizations. That is not the case. The Republicans demanded the Treasury put their proposed regulations on their work plan. And now they're mad because they do not like the answer. This is a classic case of being careful what you ask for, because you may be surprised with what you get. Let me refresh your memory for just a minute. I would like to ask unanimous consent to put into the record, number one, a recommendation 8 of the Inspector General's report, May 2013, that requires Treasury to put 501c4 regulations on the Treasury's priority guidance work plan. Number 2, 2013 Treasury priority guidance work plan that includes the 501c3. Number 3, H.R. 2532, a bill introduced by a member of this committee to require the IRS to implement all of the Inspector General's regulations. Number 4, the joint explanatory statement of the Consolidated Appropriation Act of 2014, which states, quote, "The IRS new management is expected to implement the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration's recommendations regarding the inappropriate criteria being used to identify tax-exempt applications for review," and 5, an IRS release showing that all these recommendations have been done. They've done what they were ordered to do by this committee. Now, the Republicans—
Without objection, so ordered.
The Republicans have a cult-like obsession with the IRS, and they are demanding things and then forgetting they demanded them and then being mad at the result. To get an understanding about rulemaking and how long it takes to get a final rule, let's look at the recent rulemaking example in December 2012. Treasury and the IRS issued proposed regulations on the employer shared responsibility provisions of the ACA, an important area for volunteer firefighters and other volunteer emergency responders. Yesterday, 26 months later, the IRS issued a final rule. So this proposed rule the other day is not going to go in like lightning with 23,000 comments to be taken into account before they put out the final rule. So then the question has to be, why are we here? Well, so the Republicans can use the committee to whip up the political base ahead of the 2014 election and give Fox News something to feed its audience. This committee has spent the majority of its time during this Congress operating as an arm of the Republican reelection effort, holding hearings on ACA and IRS instead of working on a myriad of other issues like SGR. Republicans want to use this committee to protect some of their biggest donors, such as Crossroads GPS, Karl Rove's 501c4. And in 2012, the Crossroads GPS spent $70 million, but they don't have to reveal their donor lists, which is the nub of the issue here. The Republicans are desperate to hide where the money comes from that Mr. Levin talked about. In 2006, $1 million was spent by this 501c4 business. Now you have, in 2012, $256 billion. Mr. Barthold, can you tell me when these rules are going to come out?
When final regulations would
Yeah.
come out? That's up to the Secretary of the Treasury after they have their hearing process and review comments.
But you've been here a long time. How long, I mean, just make a guess. Will it be next week?
I think it'd be fair to say that next week would be unlikely, but I
How
have no
about
idea.
6 months, you think?
I wouldn't want to hazard a guess.
With 23,000 letters to review, you wouldn't want to guess. How about a year? The point is that this is simply stirring up people's base. Part of I was talking to one of the members, there's a bunch of primary elections starting now. You want to get these things out there to get people
All
stirred
right,
up.
time has expired. Mr. Reichert.
Mr. Chairman, I've learned in my past career as an investigator with the King County Sheriff's Office that where there's smoke, there's fire. And in this situation, the building is on fire. And we need to continue this investigation even though the other side continues to protest so loudly. It really makes you wonder what they know that we may not know. And I have had...
I object.
I have...
The gentleman from Washington State has the time.
Thank you,
After
Mr. Chairman.
we have listened to the comments without objection from the other side, which have impugned the motives of members of this committee, and so I would say the objection is out of order, and the gentleman may continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I won't appeal the ruling. It's absurd, Mr. Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've had the opportunity to work with lots of investigators who wrote papers and documents who said, you know, I don't think we should follow this lead. There's nothing to it. I've had investigators in 19-year investigation in 49 to 51 murder cases say, you know what, this isn't going anywhere. We can't find any evidence. I quit. I give up. We are not going to give up. This is an investigation that must continue. There is information that leads us to believe that there was some wrongdoing on the part of the IRS. The American people work for themselves and for their families. They don't work for the IRS. The administration's rationale for changing these rules is because, quote, the distinction between campaign intervention and social welfare activity had created confusion, end quote. Mr. Barthold, when you were going over the new proposed regulations, I believe that you said there were 8 different categories of what would now be called candidate-related political activity. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I have a questionnaire sent by the IRS to the Tri-Cities areas in Washington State. They're the Tri-Cities Tea Party from my home state of Washington, where they applied for their tax-exempt status. just going to read some of the questions that they sent this Tea Party organization. List each past or present board member, officer, key employee, and members of their families who, first, has served on the board of another organization. Second, was or is or plans to be a candidate for public office. Indicate the nature of each candidacy. Has previously conducted similar activities for another entity. Has previously conducted similar activities for another entity. Has previously submitted an application for tax-exempt status. And these questions weren't unique. We've seen questionnaires that asked for resumes of all past or present employees and requests for donor lists. Mr. Bartol, do any of these questions have to do with any of the 8 different categories defined as candidate-related political activity in the administration's new proposed regulations?
I don't know that I can make a snap assessment of that. Would it be helpful for me to read to you the 8 categories?
No, I think the easy answer for this one is no. The questions aren't relevant to whether any organization conducts a get-out-the-vote drive, holds a candidate forum, or distributes a voter guide. They're simply questions to tie up this organization in paperwork, intimidate, and chill free speech. And that's what exactly the goal of this proposed regulations. These rules aren't about confusion. The IRS had been interpreting these laws successfully for 50 years. This is just another attempt by the administration to target these groups that are exercising their First Amendment rights. Mr. Chairman, I applaud you for introducing this legislation, and I'm proud to co-sponsor and urge my colleagues to vote yes to provide some much-needed assurance that the IRS targeting will not continue, and I yield back.
All right, thank you. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a letter from the Americans for Campaign Reform, the Brennan Center for Justice, the Campaign Legal Center, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, Common Cause Democracy 21, Demos, the League of Women Voters, Public Citizen, the Sunlight Foundation, and U.S. PIRG that I would like submitted to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, our esteemed late colleague on this committee, who was an individual who pondered many questions over and over again, would listen to the sort of argument that we've had here today, and he would simply conclude, that dog won't hunt. That was Jake Pickle. And it's not as though we haven't devoted the necessary time to this issue, even though we've been unable to uncover the conspiracy that has been richly depicted by the other side. So, Mr. Barthold, I have 3 simple questions for you. The unemployment rate stands at 6.6%, the lowest we've had in years, but not to miss the fact that there are 10 million Americans who still find themselves out of work. I have one simple question. Does the legislation before us create any jobs, help to jumpstart this economy, or address the issue of income disparity?
No, sir.
Thank you.
It's narrower.
Thank you. Mr. Barthold, as a follow-up, does this bill provide any relief to the 1.7 million Americans who find themselves unable to receive extended unemployment compensation?
That's not the topic of this legislation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barthold. Mr. Barthold, does this bill provide, in front of us today, provisions that would provide certainty to the taxpayers who utilize certain tax provisions that expired at the end of last year?
No, sir, it does not.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Bustani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 2 letters here that I'd like to submit for the record. One is from the Council for Citizens Against Government Waste, and the second is from the National Taxpayers Union.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, IRS and Treasury claim that these regulations provide clarity to the 501c4 determinations process by providing bright-line rules. These bright-line rules would replace the facts and circumstance test for 501c4s. The truth is, a lot of time and resources are wasted in the determinations process by both applicants and by the IRS. And rather than layer another set of rules upon this process, I think there are better solutions. I've proposed a concrete reform that are just that, real reform and not simply a Band-Aid on a broken system. Consider that a significant percentage of IRS resources are being spent trying to determine future activities by organizations with minuscule operating budgets, while nearly no resources are being allocated within the division to monitor actual activities based on revenue loss risk. We've seen some of this in some of the hearings we've had. I've proposed a bill
H.R. 3520 that would streamline the process for 501c4s, save small groups unnecessary filing costs, red tape, and harassment, and it would allow the IRS to allocate important resources in a more appropriate manner. That's why I support Chairman Camp's bill to delay these regulations, because the fact of the matter is the IRS is not using its resources adequately. They're harassing small groups with small resources and not doing more important work. So, quick question. Under current law, are 501c4s the only kind of 501c organizations that can engage in activities like voter registration drives, voter guides, and bipartisan candidate forums?
No, sir. 501c3, C5, C6, all those organizations can engage in that sort of activity.
And C5s are what kinds of organizations?
Labor and horticultural.
And what about sixes?
Business leagues.
And so, do the proposed regulations address these types of political activities of 501c3 organizations, or fives or sixes?
No, sir, they don't, although they did ask for comment as to whether it would be appropriate to do so.
So these new regulations proposed target 501c4s.
The proposed regulations are narrowly focused on C4 organizations, sir. Yes, sir.
And the fact of the matter is many of these are small organizations with very, very limited resources.
There's a wide, you're correct, there's a wide disparity in terms of the resources of different organizations.
So do you think that's an adequate approach or an adequate use of resources?
I'm not really in a position to make that judgment, sir.
Does it add more complexity to the work that the IRS has to undertake?
The proposed regulations, sir, or the...
Yes, the proposed regulations.
Well, it certainly defines a new standard. Whether that would be more or less complexity in terms of administration, I can't say at this time. The service did state that they thought that this would ease tax administration, and by providing some bright lines, make it easier for certain organizations to understand.
Well, is there in fact a major backlog in processing for 501c3s at this point in time?
On C3s? Yeah. We understand that to be the case, sir.
So targeting these small groups, of which there are many all across the United States, does that appear to be a useful approach?
I really can't assess the overall management of the IRS. I mean, I understand what you're asking on the face of it. Certainly on the face of it, the IRS generally does not assign lots of resources to chase small dollars. But it is the case in the exempt organizations that you're really not concerned about revenue, you're concerned about other issues. So how to weigh the amount of resources relative to the other issues that Congress has outlined is kind of a harder assessment to make.
Thank you.
All right,
That's all I
thank
have,
you.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll go to Mr. Doggett, and then I'll go 2-1. So, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the only waste here is the waste of our time with legislation of this nature. I realize...
Gentlemen would be free to yield back then.
I realize that IRS persecution of the Tea Party is part of the great pantheon of mythology of the Republican Party. And maybe that is the result of recent weeks where we've had the Republican leadership expressing concerns it was being persecuted by the Tea Party with demands for government shutdowns, and the Tea Party was concerned it was being persecuted by the Republican leadership by the possibility of some sensible bipartisan immigration reform. And one thing the two can agree on, a unifying principle, is that there's never a bad time to not attack tax collectors, tax collection, and tax levels. It is also an article of faith that there's never a bad time to encourage more secret money in politics. It's the kind of undisclosed, hidden money where
corporate interests can come in and engage in character assassination without having any responsibility for it, operating under general names that do not attribute the attacks on them. And we've seen more and more of this hidden corporate money pouring in and polluting our election process. Certainly, I don't think that a tax collector should be singling out individual groups, whether it's the Tea Party or Progress Texas in my hometown, which is very much not a Tea Party organization and which received a questionnaire originally also. What is the history of this nefarious conspiracy, very bizarre conspiracy that Republicans keep referring to? Well, it began with the testimony of a career Republican Inspector General of the Internal Revenue Service. And that witness came before us in May of last year. The hearing began with a number of very inflammatory charges about corruption and picking winners and losers and the IRS being rotten to the core, all statements that were made at the opening of the hearing. And as I questioned that career Republican Inspector General, he denied every one of the inflammatory charges that had been made. He did not find in his investigation the facts to back up the mythology that was asserted at that time. As a result of that hearing and a subsequent hearing in June of last year, and the letter to which Mr. McDermott referred, the Internal Revenue Service, not too much too soon, but too little too late, finally got around to the job of proposing some regulations. I think there are great deficiencies in those regulations, and so do all the groups to which Mr. Neal referred. All of the good government groups that have been trying to open up and expose these secret, undisclosed contributions have expressed concern about certain aspects of the Internal Revenue rulemaking. I believe that where the Internal Revenue Service got off was a long time ago when it defined exclusively social welfare organizations under the statute to be primarily, and it changed the original intent of a statute of decades and began to apply this 51% rule. I think the IRS should treat social welfare organizations as just that, social welfare, and not engaged in politics. And there are many comments that have been advanced. We're told some 23,000 that could result in a change in that rule. The only purpose of today's legislation, other than to promote this mythology, is to ensure that in the next election we have the same kind of secret, undisclosed campaign contributions through third parties that pollute our political process and distort it. This legislation is opposed by a wide range of groups that want to see change in the regulation and the way IRS functions, but don't want to postpone dealing with the problem of secret money in elections. It's legislation that should be rejected as having no basis in fact or in the prior investigations of this committee, and will not accomplish the purpose that it states it's designed to accomplish, and will have a negative effect on the operation of our democracy. I yield back.
Thank you. I would note that the Treasury Inspector General only completed an audit. We are still awaiting his final investigation, and I know those terms get confused a lot, but we have not yet gotten the final investigative report from TIGTA at this time. Mr. Roscom is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, our colleague from Texas calls it a pantheon of mythology that groups were targeted, yet it was no myth that we witnessed as members of this committee when witnesses came forth sitting in the very seats that Mr. Barthold occupies, and they told a story. And I remember the story from a pro-life activist, a woman that was running or affiliated somehow with a Right to Life group in Iowa. And what I found shocking and jarring about that testimony, and again, that was no myth. That was a real live person who had the courage to schlep out here and to tell her story, and the story she told was a chilling one. And it was a story that said that the long arm of the federal government was coming in, and it was asking that group, tell us about your prayers. Now, Mr. Chairman, We have one first freedom. Our first freedom is the freedom to worship. And when the federal government comes in, and in a very cavalier manner, says, we're going to inquire into the nature of your prayers, heaven help us. And I mean that literally. This is no myth. This is no script. This is a government that is responding to the cry of its citizens that says, come and rescue us. Now, our friend from New York somehow says that small audiences mean that issues are insignificant.
This isn't his.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you've not turned this into a version of American Idol.
Mike?
I'm glad that you've said this is a serious effort that we need to move forward on. And I'm glad that you're recognizing, Mr. Chairman, that it's the Internal Revenue Service that brought shame on itself, not the Congress that brought shame on the Internal Revenue Service. And that's what's being fixed. So we've got a situation. We still have Lois Lerner, who is at the central core component of this whole mystery, who at the very least, and I'm being very generous here, has been non-forthcoming. Can we all be satisfied with that description? She has not been forthcoming with her role, what she knew, how she acted, who she heard from, or any of this background. We don't know, because she is sitting on that information. That's a major problem. I have a group of constituents, the West Suburban Patriots from DuPage County, Illinois, who have been slow-walked in this entire process, and they've been targeted as a result of their political philosophy. That's a shame, and the shame has to be remedied, and it has to be remedied by this committee. And the ultimate of ironies today is this. Here's the headline: Obamacare employer mandate delayed again. Delay, delay, delay. And yet somehow, when that comes from the administration, that's coming down from on high, and that's a terrific idea, and it ought to be celebrated. When the chairman of the committee says, this entire thing is a mess, we need to hit the pause button on a complete train wreck and not make things more confusing and pile confusion upon confusion upon confusion and allow targeting to get away with while we still don't know the underlying facts, then somehow that is a pantheon of mythology. That's what's motivating this? It's nonsense. This is the right thing to do. Mr. Chairman, you've been careful. This is not gratuitous. It's very, very thoughtful. And I urge its passage. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce for the record a letter from the Tea Party Patriots that talks about both strong support for this bill, but makes the case that you're turning grassroots and average Americans who want to have a say in their government to be highly regulated by the same IRS that's targeted them.
Without objection, so ordered.
You know, I think the darkest days of America's history has been when the government has tried to silence the voices of those who disagree them. And make no mistake, that's what the new IRS rules do. And whether it was the targeting of civil rights activists in the 60s, the anti-war protesters of the 70s, or the constitutional and Tea Party Americans of today, make no mistake, this is the government seeking to silence the voices of those who disagree with them. The only difference is the weapon of choice this time is the IRS, the one agency that has the power to destroy your family and your business. These rules were not created out of confusion. They were created, again, to lower government power onto average Americans who simply have a disagreement about which way this country should go. And so it is critical that we stop this. And I think whether you're Republican or Democrat, liberal, conservative, Tea Party, progressive, whatever you call it, you ought to be supporting this legislation, because who does the government draw a target on in the future? And how much power will they have to enforce their power on average Americans of any political belief? So this is incredibly important for both parties, and I think for every American who may or may not at some point in their life want to speak out about their government and the direction it's going. Mr. Barthold, a question. The Inspector General did recommend some rules related to this area. but his focus was on the measurement of the social welfare activities. Does the proposed new, and that's a big distinction from what this rule does, a major distinction from it. So does this proposed new rule provide any specific rules on how to measure social welfare activities?
The proposed regulations do not address the issue of determining what's primary.
So the recommendation from the Inspector General, who revealed the targeting in the first place, isn't even present in this rule. Is that correct?
Again, you're correct. It doesn't address the measurement issue.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, I have a couple questions. To your knowledge, has the IRS acted improperly in issuing the regulations under consideration today?
The IRS and the Treasury always have authority to issue regulations.
I think that answers my next one. Do they have the authority to issue these regulations?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Are the proposed regulations in line with the Inspector General's recommendations?
I don't really have a good assessment of that. That's right. That'd be more for the committee members to judge. They took the evidence from the Inspector General.
And in your best estimation, or based on prior IRS regulations, what timeline do you see final regulations being issued, and is it likely that they would be issued within the year?
Yeah. I have no idea, sir. They do have a hearing scheduled, right? There's a hearing. They talk of a hearing scheduled in terms of reviewing some of the letters and taking comments. I'll have to check on the date of that. I did see some discussion of scheduling a hearing.
And they're still open for public comment until February 27th?
Yes, sir,
correct?
until just before the end of the month.
And can members of Congress submit comments on these regulations expressing their
any
concerns?
organization or individual, members of Congress included, sir.
And before the rule becomes final, does Congress have the authority to review the rule before it takes effect and express its disapproval of the rule?
Not routinely. I don't think so as a matter of standard procedures. I mean, the Congress may always overrule a legislation or delay it as the...
And I would just say that, you know, sort of the administrative procedures are outside the scope of the Joint Committee on Taxation.
We could still...
You can ask him, but I just am telling you that
I'm just
that's
not-
not
I'm
his
just not sure.
expertise.
So the
It's the
IRS...
technical aspects of the bill.
The IRS has operated within their authority. They're taking steps to improve the situation. And if you all remember, at the first hearing that we had on this, was one of the things that I expressly commented on, that we should be working collectively to improve the situation at the IRS and figuring out how to do that. They're taking action on regulations that in some instances the Inspector General proposed, some that we proposed. Matter of fact, my friend from Illinois has a bill that would require the IRS to implement all of the Inspector General's recommendations. Yet we're meeting today after 6 separate investigations that found no political motivation, and we're going through this hearing, ignoring the major issues of concern to the American people, as Mr. Neal pointed out, and going to pass a bill that, as I read it, really has no impact on this issue, because if in fact the new rules are finalized, Mr. Barthold, would the investigation go away somehow?
The Congress's investigations are independent of regulatory actions, sir.
So that those investigations would continue to take place to get at the root of the problem, if there is a root of the problem. And yet we've just spent the whole morning dealing with something that looks to me to be a political charade. And I think that is as wrong as it was wrong for the IRS to group application by names. And we should be looking for solutions to this issue to make the situation better at the IRS and make the situation better for the American taxpayers. I yield back.
Thank you. I would just say it's not about this committee. It's about the constitutional rights of the people that are affected by this proposed regulations. And
Mr.
with
Chairman,
that,
I'm not disputing that, reclaiming my time. I'm not disputing that. But what purpose does it serve to pass this bill? We're still going to have the investigation. Everybody on this committee, everybody, there's no daylight between us as to whether or not we believe what happened was wrong and as to whether or not we want it fixed.
there's a couple of things it will do. One, it will allow TIGTA to complete their investigation.
Why
Two,
can't they?
They haven't concluded that, and that is, of course, independent of the Congress. Two, it will allow us to complete our investigation.
can still
As
do
I've
an
said, we don't have all of the documents that we've requested, and I gave the new commissioner in January a list of things that we still need. And as far as we know, no victim has been interviewed by any government agency, and the
But how
only
does
forum
this-
they've had is this
How
committee
does this
hearing.
truncate the investigation?
Well, if this proposed reg goes through, then the constitutional rights of the people involved in these organizations are limited in terms of their ability to conduct nonpartisan activities like candidate forums and get out the vote and voter
How is
instruction,
that?
which is one of their
How
rights.
does that happen? Because I don't read that in this bill at all.
Well, that's exactly what it does, because it limits certain activities, redefines them as outside of the social welfare. And it actually includes get out the vote efforts as social welfare, so they aren't able to do them as they would have. So it
Did you
limits
still
their
have
ability
time?
very much.
I do.
His time has expired. Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that we can pass this one-year delay that I think is very reasonable as the details are getting worked out. Mr. Barthold, now the difference between a 501c3 and a C4, I mean, there might be several, but among them is the tax deductibility of a contribution to that organization. Is that accurate?
That's correct, sir.
So a 501c3 receives tax-deductible donations.
Yes, sir.
A 501c4 does not receive tax-deductible donations.
That's correct, sir.
Both groups can engage in political activity to some degree, get out the vote efforts, voter registration drives, and others. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
So the proposed regulation that this legislation would delay 1 year would only target the 501c4 organization, correct?
The legislation only addresses guidance for 501c4.
Right, and the regulation as well.
Yes.
The regulation itself targets the 501c4.
The proposed regulation was only about activities of 501c4 organizations, sir. That's correct.
So perhaps the nature of 501c3s perhaps has more to do with revenue to the federal government than 501c4?
Well, the 501c3 organizations are generally referred to as charitable organizations. People may make deductible contributions to charitable organizations, so the tax deductibility of those contributions to charitable organizations is an important feature of our income tax system. So it is, deductibility of those contributions is a large revenue item.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just hope that we can advance this bill. I think it's very reasonable because there are some unclear situations, and I appreciate your efforts. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a letter here from the Independent Women's Voice, the president and CEO of that organization, and I think she summarizes the peanut of the issue quite well when she writes, the right to express one's political beliefs without legal fear of government intimidation or reprisal is one of the bedrock principles that sets the United States apart from other nations. The IRS should not be in the business of making it hard to exercise that constitutionally protected right, but ought instead be doing what it can to salvage and restore its reputation for nonpartisan, non-politicized fair play. I support this legislation, and Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit this letter for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
I thank the chairman, and I want to say that I concur with a lot of the things that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have had to say. I thought that Mr. Teaberry, Mr. Roscom, Mr. Bustani, in talking about how this legislation, how people have been impacted by the IRS was insightful and certainly real. I further agree with Mr. Thompson and Mr. Neal that you would think, therefore, then, that to postpone rather than to fix immediately should be in order. Further, and I'll put the cynical side aside for the moment, that we should be focused on jobs and putting the country back to work. But what we're confronted with here, when we look at these problems as it relates to the IRS, as it relates to the NSA, as it relates to campaigns in general, we are faced as a body that has about a 9% overall rating with the American public of being pawns caught up in the world that we live in. The whole system of campaign finance is a cesspool, and it needs to be drained, and it's going to need a bipartisan effort that focuses on disclosure, amending the Constitution to protect those very constitutional rights that everyone has talked about, to reform a system so that every member of Congress isn't spending most of their time chasing money over the phone instead of spending time in committee dealing with issues, and empower people to vote, which is also the real issue here in campaign finance, of making sure that every American has the right to vote. When 0.0011% contribute 93% of all the money in super PACs, and that's what ends up driving elections, we have a real problem here. It's one that we paper over because of what that famous songstress Laura Nyro once said: money, money, money. Sometimes I feel like a pawn in my own world. We found the system, we lost the pearl. We found the system here. Everybody knows how to go out and raise money. Everybody does. But we lost the pearl, the republic, the people that we represent. And increasingly, we should be outraged when the IRS goes after them or anyone. But we should be equally outraged with how this great government of ours, this great republic, has become bought and sold by the special interest. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this important legislation before us today. Mr. Barthold, can you describe the proposed regulations' effect on election-related activities?
The proposed regulations would change the definition of present law from election-related activity to campaign-related political activity. Among some of the changes is it would broaden what qualifies as candidate related under present law. Comments or activity related to nominations to executive branch offices or to or judicial nominations are not considered political campaign intervention activity. Under the proposed regulations, they would be considered candidate-related political activity. So that's one example of the change, sir.
So let me just ask you another question about an example. So what you're saying then is that if a 501c4 group hosted a civics class for homeschooled children, and then let's say they invited an individual who's running for public office, that would count against it? Would this count against it as a candidate related to political activity?
That sounds like you're describing what would be considered a candidate forum, which would be bad, let me call it bad activity as social welfare.
So even if there's no mention of an upcoming election whatsoever, that would disqualify
if the individuals are known to be running for office, Yes, that would be, that under the proposed regulations, I understand that would be candidate-related political activity.
Even if the audience is a classroom of school children that are too young to vote?
I believe that would still be the case, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I think this just points out why we need to delay these regulations for a longer period of time till, not number one, for the investigation to go forward, but two, just to point out the problems and inconsistencies of how this is being applied to certain organizations and certain qualifications that these organizations apply for under current law that have been in, these rules have been in place for 50 years, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Reed, and then Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do applaud your efforts in bringing this legislation here before us today. And I would just encourage my colleagues from the other side of the aisle to join us in delaying the implementation of these regulations, because we are talking about a fundamental right here in making sure that an agency of the United States government is not targeting our citizens because of their political belief structure. And what I see in these proposed regulations are very concerning issues to me. And I think a reasonable delay of 1 year is a reasonable approach to this situation. I would remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle the words of our president recently. He said there was no smidgen of corruption in regards to this issue, and that got a lot of attention. But there were also words spoken by our commander-in-chief where he said boneheaded decisions were made in the IRS. Now, I don't know who made those decisions, because we're still waiting the results of investigations here on this Hill that are underway as we speak. There are 6 investigations that were testified to recently before the Ways and Means Committee that we're waiting for the results here in this committee to receive. We have heard from the Inspector General, and as the Chairman rightfully pointed out, they completed the audit, but the investigation is not complete by the Inspector General. Yet our Commander-in-Chief has said that boneheaded decisions were made on this issue of targeting groups in America. Well, I want to know who. I want to know who made those decisions, because when you talk about boneheaded decisions, that tells me, and that concedes, that there were well thought out, conscious, deliberative decisions made in the agency. And if we're talking about the agencies that's promulgating these regulations, I think what better way to deal with those boneheaded decisions than to ensure that any action on this issue be delayed until those investigations are fully completed. I want to know who made those decisions. I want to know why those decisions were made. And before we move forward with regulations that may instill in our bureaucracy some of those boneheaded decisions, I would make sure that we err on the side of caution when we are talking about something as serious as our freedom of speech and expression and ability to believe, and rather be targeted by our government like we have seen in these agency actions up to this point in time. So I'd encourage my colleagues on the other side to join us in this effort. And as my colleague had indicated on the other side of the aisle, we should have comfort that the bureaucracy of Washington, D.C. will take 20-plus months, 6 months or more, and that really this is not necessary. Well, then what's the harm in joining us in this effort? If the agencies themselves are not going to promulgate final regulations for months and months and months, why don't we just enact legislation here on the Hill to safeguard and say, you know what, let's just not rely on the agency and the bureaucracy of Washington, D.C. Why don't we legislate and say, okay, if it's a non-issue, just join us. Then I don't see where the objection should arise. So I encourage you, Chairman, in regards to this proposed legislation, and I will join in support of making sure that we don't trample in this area that is so critical to us as free citizens of this great country. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I neglected to recognize Mr. Becerra. Mr. Becerra, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartow, thank you very much for your testimony today. Let me make sure I can go through some of this very quickly here. Social welfare organizations, so-called Section 501c4 organizations, are exempt from federal taxes, right?
That's correct, sir.
So average American doesn't have the same status as a so-called social welfare organization, because we are not exempt from paying taxes. We may ultimately be able to reduce our taxes or may find that we don't earn enough to have to pay taxes, but we're not automatically, just by our status, exempt from paying taxes. And so these 501c4 organizations, these social welfare organizations, have a status that's special as compared to a regular taxpayer who doesn't have a special tax status. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. These social welfare organizations do not have to disclose their donors to the public. Is that correct?
To the public, that's correct, sir.
Right. So as far as America is concerned, if I form one of these 501c4 social welfare organizations, no one in the public will ever get to see who gives money to my organization.
That is correct, sir.
Okay. And is it accurate to say that these social welfare organizations do have the ability to make political expenditures?
Yes, sir. It goes back to being primarily engaged in activities toward the common good.
Right. Right. So we're looking for these social welfare organizations to be primarily focused on helping the common good. Now, if I can show the chart that we have, I think you were asked a question previously, but let me try to move to it again. In 2006, these social welfare organizations collected from donors about $1 million altogether. In 2012, 6 years later, $256 million. Now, maybe Americans wouldn't have been concerned when only $1 million, only $1 million had been contributed to these social welfare organizations in 2006. But now you got $256 million going into these organizations, social welfare organizations. And what we're finding is a whole bunch of these social welfare organizations are essentially nothing more than political organizations. Maybe some people think it's okay to be able to hide your money, to be able to spend money to do political activity when you should be doing social good. But I think the more egregious concern should be that we have no idea who's giving this money. Do we know if it's foreigners who are giving this money? Mr. Bartold?
As you had pointed out, sir, there's protection against disclosure.
So let's say it's a foreign entity or foreign individual who's giving money to a social organization. The public can't find out about that.
That would be correct under present law for a C4 organization, sir.
Okay. So we have no idea if friend or foe is giving money to any of these so-called social organizations that end up using a lot of their money for political expenditures.
The political expenditure aspect aside, in terms of disclosure, what you've stated is correct, sir.
Yeah. So $256 million in 2012. No reason to believe it would go down. You see the line. It continues to grow. And now I think what we're trying to say is, hey, at least show us who's giving the money. Doesn't mean you can't give it for political purposes, or at least maybe we should restrict it a little bit more so your social welfare organization is doing social welfare, but at least tell us who's giving the money. Now, there is actually a provision in the tax code that allows an organization to collect money and use it for political purposes and disclose their donors. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Becerra, I believe you're directing attention to 527 organizations, right, sir.
We know these organizations under the Section 527 as super PACs that are out there making contributions, political expenditures. But we know where their donors are coming from because they have to identify them. But these so-called social welfare organizations are spending money, in many cases, for political purposes, expanding at exponential rates, and America has no way of knowing what it's being used for. And now there are some in this Congress who would delay some of the reforms that would help us at least disclose who these are. I think what we're finding is that there are some folks who are trying to hide who these donors are, and I would think the American public would be against that. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And without objection, I would also place into the record Open Secrets, which lists the top all-time donor from '89 to 2014, which happens to be AFSCME Union, which would be able to give as a 501c5. So there's a lot more to this picture simply than that particular chart. Mr. Kelly's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'd also like to place a letter from Traditional Values Coalition in support of H.R. 3865 for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. And thanks for holding today's hearing. Mr. Barthol, to your knowledge, any of the investigations on the IRS attacks on these conservative groups been completed yet?
Mr. Kelly, I'm not party to any of the investigations, but by press accounts, they're not complete.
So, I mean, and to your knowledge, and this is what I've read, nobody's been briefed on any of it so far because it's not complete.
I certainly have not, sir, but I have no special knowledge of any of the investigations.
Well, and then I wonder then, we're not talking about anything other than 501c4s with this on the regulation, right? Not 501c3s, not 501c5s, not 501c6. It's all just 501c4s. Is that correct?
H.R. 3865 is solely directed at guidance of relating to Section 501c4. That is correct, sir.
Yeah. A friend of mine who just got done running for the U.S. Senate, a guy named Tom Smith from back in my district in western Pennsylvania, has a group called the Indiana Armstrong Patriots. It took the Indiana Armstrong Patriots, which is a Tea Party group, by the way, a year and a half to go through the process and be given a 501c4 status. That status has now been revoked. And they're, I think, in their 8th month now of trying to get the status reversed and put back in there. So what the chairman has asked about today is a 1-year delay on a new regulation that specifically targets the group that have already been targeted. And what I'm confused is that both sides of this group, of this committee, should be very concerned that there is no answers yet on what happened in the IRS. Where did it go from the time it was supposed to be a couple rookies in Cincinnati screwing up, and which we know now isn't the case, to all the confusion which we know didn't exist, but there was a calculated strategy for how to handle this situation. That's what's being investigated, is it not? I mean, just your general knowledge. I know it's not something you deal with every day, but your general knowledge.
The investigations are looking at the problems in terms of approving C4 organizations.
Yeah. And if I remember right, Lady Justice wears a blindfold and she holds a scale. The idea is she's supposed to be blind and impartial. She's supposed to look, everything is supposed to be weighed and not looked at in any particular way. So I don't care what the color of the jelly bean is. That shouldn't have any effect on it at all. There has been an outrageous attack on 501c4s. This isn't made up. As far as being political, yeah, there's a lot of political things that go on. We just had another stay on the Affordable Care Act for the employer mandate. Now, I'm sure that's not political, but the confusing part, I think, for the American people is that we come here representing them. I'm a Republican, folks on the other side are Democrat, but that's not who they represent in their districts. They represent the American people. So it's not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue or a Libertarian issue or any particular, it's an issue about fair and equal treatment under the law. This piece today that we're talking about, all the chairman has asked for is a 1-year delay. I would just say that in most cases, early detection leads to the right kind of correction. If we are at a point right now where we don't even know yet what the results of the investigation are, we'll say, oh, no, nothing to be seen here, folks. Let's move on. That's something American people don't trust anymore because they've heard it too many times and found out it's not true. So I'm with the rest of my colleagues. I say, Chairman, thank you for bringing this forward, and I'd like to see us move this forward today, and let's move on with the work of the people and making sure that they do feel protected under the law.
All right, thank you. Mr. Davis.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Becerra first.
Yeah, I apologize, Mr. Davis. I forgot to ask, Mr. Chairman, for unanimous consent to include the chart that I used during my 5 minutes into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthol, could you just describe for us the differences between 501c3, 501c4 and the 527 PACs?
The 501c3 organizations are charitable organizations. They can receive tax-deductible contributions from individuals and from corporations. They're primarily engaged in charitable activities, and the amount of lobbying or political activity is actually quite circumscribed. The 501c4 organizations, social welfare organizations, under the current law and regulations, are supposed to be primarily engaged in activities that promote the general welfare. Certain political campaign intervention activities are not considered good activities towards satisfying that primarily engaged in test. As a couple of your colleagues have asked, 501c4 organizations, as is the case with 501c3 organizations, do not have to publicly disclose their donor lists. A 527 organization is an organization that's primarily engaged in political activity, so it can be political parties, PACs, campaign organizations, and they may take contributions. The contributions are not counted as income. Their activities are considered exempt functions as long as it's on these defined political activities. One requirement that distinguishes the different organizations is that, in general, a 527 organization is required to file periodic reports on contributions, generally of $200 or more, and also on qualifying expenditures.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does the bill that we're considering today, does it include any provisions that would raise the debt limit so that 26 million Americans who are supposed to receive their Social Security checks on March the 3rd are paid on time and in full?
No, this bill's not related to that fiscal issue, sir.
Does the bill include provisions that would raise the debt limit and ensure that there is no delay to the over 100 million taxpayers who are due refunds this year?
The bill's not related to the debt limit.
Does this bill offer any kind of solution to the issues that physicians face with respect to reimbursement for Medicare patients?
No, sir, it's not. The bill is not related to Medicare reimbursements.
Does the bill before us include any provisions that would provide certainty to the taxpayers who make use of certain tax provisions that expired at the end of last year?
This bill does not relate to the so-called extenders or expiring provisions, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I would certainly agree that we need to investigate, and find out a lot of things, but I do think that there are other issues that are just as, and perhaps more important, and that our time should be spent on those. And I thank you, Mr. Barthold, for your answers, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just ask unanimous consent that a letter from Freedom Works in support of H.R. 3865 be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Mr. Pascrell. You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, everyone knows the First Amendment protects freedom of speech. It's one of the great things about this country, but nowhere in the Bill of Rights does it say you have the freedom to say anything you want and also not pay any taxes. There's nowhere in the Bill of Rights. So let's get this straight here. There is no God-given right to tax-exempt status, as some would like to believe. Congress has given some organizations that right. The fact is, there is already a section of the tax code that lets you set up a tax-exempt organization that can participate in all political activity at once. It's called Section 527. So let's cut through this stuff here, get down to what this is all about. It is about disclosure. Mr. Barthorn, can you tell me what the difference is between a 527 and a 501c4 group when it comes to the disclosure of contributors?
Yes, Mr. Pascrell. Let me start with 501c4 organization. 501c4 organization is supposed to file certain donor information as part of its Form 990 filing with the IRS concerning donor identity, but this information is not made public as a general matter. 527 organizations, on the other hand, are required to file periodic reports of contributions, generally those contributions in excess of $200, and it's also supposed to file periodic reports detailing expenditures of generally greater than $500. During an election year, the reports of 527 organizations are actually required to be filed more frequently than in an off year.
Thank you. So the catch about Section 527 is that while you can be both tax exempt and make political expenditures, your contributors must be disclosed. Is that correct?
One of the requirements of a 527 organization is the disclosure requirement, sir. That's correct.
In other words, billionaires like Sheldon Adelson and Koch brothers can't anonymously funnel hundreds of millions of dollars to their preferred candidates unless we, the American people, know where the money came from. Mr. Chairman, none of us want to see what happened at the IRS last year happen again, whatever happened. And it's clear from your investigation that the reason this happened was because the outdated regulations sowed confusion and led to some very bad decisions. The IRS needs clear rules of the road on how it should determine how much political activity is appropriate and how much political activity goes over the line. And the 501c4 groups do as well, just as the Inspector General urged. But we can't let big money donors continue to exploit a loophole in our tax code simply because they want to hide in the shadows instead of following the rules. So I urge a no vote. We must let the IRS go through its process, including public comment. If necessary, a disapproval resolution under the Congressional Review Act is always an option for the majority. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schock is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity and for you having this hearing on this important issue that continues. I think for the benefit of the public, we should review some of the facts as we know them, because I'm just a little disturbed to hear some of my friends on the other side of the aisle suggest that somehow this is a manufactured problem, that somehow the investigation is complete, that we have all of the necessary information to make a determination, and somehow this is an effort on our side to keep something open for politics. And if that's truly the view of some on the other side, I would simply, in all honesty, ask for your assistance to expedite the process by which we can get the information so that all of us can make a determination, the American people can be aware of what happened, and most importantly, those, if there are those who did some things wrong, can be held accountable. Let me remind you that this issue broke last May of 2013. The TICTA and the IG report was made public. Lois Lerner was the first to go public and say that targeting had occurred. And all of the information up until this point refers back to Lois Lerner. Her emails, the delays, the proposed regulations all point back to Lois Lerner. And so it was in June, a month later, in 2013, that our committee chairman and this committee requested copies of Lois Lerner's emails, 500,000 pages of documents, all of which are within the purview of this committee. None of them legally have to be redacted because our committee chairman has, through Section 6103, the opportunity to review taxpayer information. And yet, for some reason, the IRS has chosen only to refer to this committee, provide to this committee, a fraction of those documents, about 7,000 of the 500,000 documents. And so I think any person would say, what for? Why? What's the holdup? What's the delay? What's the justification? And I would hope this would be a bipartisan effort that we could work together to get the IRS to report the information that this committee, regardless of who holds the gavel, is entitled to. Now, further troubling is the fact that we now have an email dating to 2012, a year prior to the TICTA and IG report, that talks about Lois Lerner discussing off-plan regulations about 501c4 and how they might target. Now, the reason this is news is because in November, just a few months ago, the IRS said that as a result of the report in May, as a result of the TICTA and IG report of May of this year, we're now coming up with some guidelines. False. A year before the TICTA report, a year before the IG report, Lois Lerner says in her email, we're discussing off-plan regulations dealing with 501c4. Somebody's lying. There's more to the story. Perhaps in the 400,000 pages of emails that this committee, that our chairman has been denied to look at. So this investigation is not over. The answers to these questions, which are rightfully asked, have not been given. And at least this side of the aisle does not intend to let up on finding out who is responsible for this targeting and why there is such inconsistency in information coming out of the IRS through the past 2 years relative to targeting of these conservative groups. So to those who would suggest we need to expedite this, to those who are somewhat frustrated that this continues, let me join you in your frustration. But please join us in demanding from the IRS the information that is rightfully ours, the information that is rightfully under the jurisdiction of this committee, and the information that is required to get to the bottom of this targeting that should never have happened to hardworking taxpayers in this country. So I would just ask my friends on the other side of the aisle, please join us. Help us get this information. If there's nothing in the 400,000-page emails, then let's move on. But there's been a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of misinformation up until this point, and we need those documents to be able to settle what exactly happened. I yield back.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Crowley.
Thank you. I thank the chairman for giving me the time, and I appreciate the comments of my friend from Illinois. There's been a lot of discussion about emails all of a sudden appearing out of the blue. That's what one would be led to believe. The reality is the IRS has been cooperating all along with this investigation. There is an ongoing investigation. Our committee is investigating. We know that the other committees with the House representatives are investigating as well. Is there confusion? Yeah. I think there's a lot of confusion in terms of the applicability of 501c4s in this country. Is there incompetence? Yeah. I think there's a great deal of competence demonstrated at the IRS. Misguidance on guidance. to put it bluntly. Corruption, I know you guys want corruption. I understand that, but none, zero, zilch.
Will
No
the gentleman
corruption.
yield? Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. I will momentarily. No corruption has been linked to the White House. I know that upsets you. I know it upsets a lot of my colleagues on the side of the aisle. And I know you're doing your best to keep this at the forefront, and you will continue to do that. But one has to ask themselves a question. Darrell Issa from California is known as a very aggressive chairman of his committee, was given details, information about this prior to the election, the re-election of the president. Do you not think for a moment that he would not have used that information if he could to politically to undermine the president and his credibility? And he didn't even see this as an issue back then. But once again, we keep keeping this issue alive because in this unquenchable desire to link this to the president, to the White House, I think the American people are tired of this. They'd like us to get back to investigating, delving into these issues, but finding solutions to the problem and not continue to find the attempt of a smoking gun, as I called last week, a cap gun. Because in the end, a lot of smoke, but nothing else there. I will yield to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. All I would say is I don't know how you can say with definity that there's no corruption when we haven't been allowed to see the evidence. I mean, at the end of the day, look, I'm not suggesting there's anything attached to the White House here. I don't know anybody that's suggesting that. What I am suggesting is all roads lead to Mrs. Lerner.
Reclaiming my time, what I will suggest is that the continued barrage and the political rhetoric from your side of the aisle has been overwhelming in suggesting that there was political corruption here at the IRS connected to the White House. You can argue otherwise, but that's clearly my interpretation. I think the American people's interpretation as well. And I think they're tired of it. I think they want us to get back to doing the work of the committee and get this committee back to the historical nature of its committee itself, not to be as partisan as we've become, and to get back and actually delving into these issues, dealing with the issue of 501c4s, 501c3s, and where it's applicable, we should interject and say no. We've gone too far. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right.
I will yield to the gentleman from Michigan.
The gentleman yielded back. Ms. Black is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Michigan. I've still a green light, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Michigan.
All I suggest to the gentleman from Illinois is to go back over the statements that have come from this side. Those allegations have been precisely made. They were made in the opening statement of the hearing. We'll send you all the quotes. All the quotes. I'm going to do that. These allegations have been made from the very beginning, despite the fact that the gentleman who testified at that hearing said there was no evidence of corruption, no evidence of political intervention. I'll send them to you. And now we're going to circulate them to the press. You're wrong. Those allegations have been the gist of this effort of this committee, and it's a disgrace to the honor of this committee.
I would say that we still have not gotten the investigative report from the Treasury Inspector General. The gentleman's time. Does the gentleman wish to make another comment?
And yet we're going to move ahead with this bill when we haven't finished the investigation yet. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
We're still waiting for the report from the Treasury Inspector General. They have not concluded their final investigation. So Ms. Black is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bolton, I'm going to be really quick with my question, but I want to go back to the questioning that the gentleman from New Jersey was talking about, disclosure of donors. Is it not correct that C3s, C4s, and C5s, which are unions, are not required to report publicly their donors? They are required to report those to the IRS, but not publicly, so that there is equal treatment on the C3s, C4s, and C5s. Is that not correct?
That's correct, Ms. Black.
Thank you. That's my only point. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing about being the last cowboy in a rodeo is sometimes you end up jumping on the same horse. But, Mr. Barthold, I'm just going to try and simplify this after all this discussion, because I'm hearing everything from 501c4s and 3s and tax code. I mean, this H.R. 3865 would prohibit for 1 year the Treasury and IRS from finalizing the proposed 501c4 regulations, correct? That's all this?
It would prohibit finalizing the proposed regulations or making other, providing other general guidance that, during that period.
Right. And even if this is passed today, it doesn't stop the IRS or the Treasury from continuing their process. And I heard from one gentleman today that this could take up to 26 weeks. I mean, so they could be doing this for the next 12 months anyway, correct?
Yes, sir, they could.
And I know there's an investigation still going on. I know the chairman has indicated there's an investigation going on. If I would just ask you this question, I know how I would answer it. If I was going to propose regulations, I would want to know everything before I finalize and propose regulations, including I would want to know the results of the investigation. If you were in that situation, would you want to know the results of the investigation?
Well, that's really not an appropriate question for me to answer. That's, members should make their own judgments on that.
But I mean, again, it just makes common sense. This isn't, you know, I keep hearing politics and political. This isn't a political issue. This is a common sense issue. I represent 720,000 people back in my district who would want to know all the facts before proposed regulations are submitted. So, you know, I applaud the efforts of the chairman for introducing H.R. 3865, which is really just a simple delay for 1 year and on these proposed regulations, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All right, thank you. There being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to.
We want a roll call vote. Okay, roll call and final, okay.
I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 3865 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Aye. We're out here today. They're putting me on the spot. He just brought it.
No.
No.
Including
McDermott.
I don't want to get
No.
what an asshole.
Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no.
That's it,
Mr. Larson? Mr.
Seawood Foreman, whatever that is. Tree.
Mr. Kine? No. Mr. Kine, aye. Mr. Kine, yes. Mr. Pascarelli? No. Mr. Pascarelli, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz?
I don't think they have you recorded yet.
Mr. Davis? No. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? No. Ms. Sanchez, no.
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Thank you.
Mr. Larson, no. Ms. Schwartz?
She's gone forever.
Aye.
Something for you to read about and think about. We'll talk when we get back.
Okay. Thanks, Jim.
The clerk will report the vote. There being 23 ayes and 13 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 3865 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. And without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.